At 9:30 on the rain-soaked evening of October 24, 1942, as the relentless humidity of Guadalcanal pressed heavily upon the jungle and the oppressive darkness erased even the faintest outline of a man's hand held inches from his face, Sergeant Ralph Briggs, one of only 47 Marines sent forward as an observation post deep in enemy territory, picked up a field telephone on a ridge 3,000 yards south of Henderson Field and reported to Lieutenant Colonel Louis Chesty Puller, the legendary and battle-hardened commander of the 1st Battalion, 7th Marine Regiment, that he could hear hundreds upon hundreds of Japanese soldiers moving through the jungle, their voices rising and falling in eerie, confident rhythms, their footsteps crushing wet leaves, their equipment clinking and rattling as they advanced steadily toward the thin American defensive line in the night. Briggs told Puller that he was surrounded. "Colonel, there's about 3,000 Japs between you and me," and Puller, incredulous but trusting his Marine, asked if he was certain. Briggs replied without hesitation that he had heard them singing, laughing, and smoking cigarettes as they passed through the brush in staggering numbers, moving toward Henderson Field with a confidence that suggested they expected to steamroll the American defenses before dawn. That warning gave Puller, and the exhausted, undermanned Marines depending upon him, barely 30 minutes to prepare for the most important battle of their lives. 30 minutes to check weapons, load belts, redistribute ammunition, adjust fields of fire, call desperately for artillery support and reinforcement, and steel themselves psychologically for the violent tidal wave of humanity about to crash into their positions. At that moment, the Americans had roughly 11,000 Marines and a newly arrived Army regiment holding a perimeter around Henderson Field, while the Japanese had over 20,000 troops on Guadalcanal, troops their commander, Lieutenant General Harakichi Hyakutake, believed would deliver the decisive victory of the Pacific War by annihilating the defenders and capturing the airfield in a single night of overwhelming assault. The core of the Japanese offensive would strike directly into the sector held by the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, a dangerously understrength battalion responsible for a front originally designed for an entire regiment, a sector anchored on a ridge Marines would later call Coffin Corner, and within that sector, in the precise path of the Japanese main effort, sat the two machine gun sections commanded by a 26-year-old Marine named John Basilone, a man whose story would become legend. Basilone, born Giovanni Basilone in Raritan, New Jersey, the son of Italian immigrants, one of 10 children, raised in a working-class neighborhood where neighbors shared meals and hardship, had experienced military life long before the Marines. At 17, he joined the U.S. Army, serving 3 years in the Philippines where he earned the nickname Manila John for his boxing prowess and where he fell in love with the structure, discipline, and brotherhood of military service. After leaving the Army, he tried civilian life as a truck driver but soon found himself restless, yearning to return to service. Believing he could get back to the Philippines faster by joining the Marines, he enlisted again in 1940 and quickly distinguished himself as a machine gunner and weapons instructor. On Guadalcanal, he placed his 6M 1917A1 water-cooled .30 caliber machine guns, each weighing nearly 100 pounds with tripod and full water jacket, across the most probable avenues of approach into the ridge, overlapping their fields of fire so that any enemy who advanced would face converging streams of bullets sweeping the jungle like scythes. Yet despite Basilone's preparation, despite the Marine Corps' discipline, the defenders were in dire condition. Supplies were scarce. Soldiers fought while sick with malaria, dysentery, and dengue fever. They were exhausted, unwashed, running on stolen rice, moldy bread, and captured Japanese rations, their bodies wasted from disease and hunger. Many had fevers over 103 degrees yet refused to abandon their posts because there were no replacements. The Japanese, meanwhile, had spent weeks preparing their offensive. Hyakutake had personally briefed Emperor Hirohito, promising a glorious victory. He had assembled artillery pieces dragged through the jungle by sweating soldiers in a brutal logistical nightmare, brought in tanks and heavy equipment via night destroyer runs, and positioned the elite Sendai Division for a massive attack. Yet his forces were plagued by miscalculation. His maps were wrong, his reconnaissance non-existent, and his belief that Marines would flee at the sight of a determined banzai charge fatally flawed. On October 23, the Japanese diversionary attack across the Mataniko River had been obliterated by Marine artillery before the infantry even reached the water, with 9 Japanese tanks destroyed by anti-tank guns and hundreds of enemy dead littering the riverbanks by sunrise. But despite this failure, the Americans shifted attention westward, thinning the very sector the Japanese planned to hit hardest. Puller's southern line remained dangerously exposed, manned by only 1,000 Marines spread across nearly a mile of front, anchored by Basilone's machine guns. When Briggs' warning came, Puller called urgently for Army reinforcements from the 164th Infantry Regiment, but those Green troops had just arrived on the island, had no idea of the terrain, and would take time to reach the line. Basilone, hearing Briggs' report, passed word to his men: check belts, clean barrels, refill water jackets, clear arcs, prepare for hell. Then the night grew impossibly silent, right up until the Japanese opened fire with mortars, mountain guns, and artillery. Shell bursts illuminated the jungle in violent flashes of orange and white. Shrapnel whirled through the air like razor-edged hornets. Dirt, roots, and body parts rained down as Marines pressed themselves into foxholes and prayed the next blast wouldn't land on top of them. The barrage lasted 30 minutes, but the Japanese had limited ammunition, much of it dragged by hand through miles of jungle, and when the shelling stopped, the infantry attack began. Out of the darkness surged the first wave, hundreds of Japanese soldiers charging uphill at full speed, screaming banzai, firing rifles, tossing grenades, driven by a cultural belief that spiritual superiority and willingness to die would guarantee victory. They expected the Marines to panic. Instead, Basilone's machine guns erupted in continuous, rhythmic, thunderous bursts. Tracers streaked through the blackness. Enemy soldiers fell in groups, cut down mid-scream, their bodies tumbling down the slope. The guns overheated, steaming heavily as water boiled from their jackets. Basilone moved between guns under fire, shouting adjustments, clearing jams, working the feed trays with his bare hands even as the metal scorched his palms. The first wave collapsed. The second surged forward with greater coordination, supported by mortars and grenades. One of Basilone's positions was hit directly. 3 crew members died instantly, their bodies thrown backwards in a flash of fire and smoke. Basilone grabbed the spare gun, hauled it alone into a new firing position, set it up in seconds, and unleashed sustained fire until the second wave finally broke under the weight of casualties. But ammunition was running dangerously low. The Marines were firing faster than ammunition bearers could supply them. Basilone realized that if his guns ran dry, the Japanese would pour through the line and reach Henderson Field. With absolute clarity, he made a decision that defied every tactical doctrine ever written. He left his position and ran alone through pitch-black jungle filled with enemy infiltrators to retrieve ammunition from the rear. Carrying a .45 pistol, he sprinted 150 yards through darkness broken only by explosions and muzzle flashes, dodging Japanese soldiers, slipping in mud, stumbling over roots, and hearing whispered voices of infiltrators around him. He reached the ammo dump, loaded himself with 90 pounds of ammunition belts and cans, more than most men could even lift, and ran back the same deadly route. On his second run, he encountered a group of infiltrators attempting to reach the battalion command post. In a split-second flash of artillery light, he saw their silhouettes, dropped the ammunition, drew his pistol, and killed 3 at close range before recovering the ammo and continuing his run. On the third run, Japanese mortars rained down on the trail, and each time Basilone heard the whistling arc of a shell, he threw himself into the mud, feeling the shock waves slam into his ribs and fling debris across his back. Each time he rose again, grabbing the ammunition, stumbling forward, refusing to stop. He made 4 ammunition runs in total, each time essential, each time almost suicidal. By midnight, the bodies of Japanese soldiers were piled so high in front of the Marine positions that Basilone's guns could no longer fire low enough to hit those advancing behind the dead. Under continuous fire, Basilone called for volunteers, and several Marines crawled forward into the open, dragging bodies aside to clear firing lanes as bullets cracked past their helmets and snapped branches beside their heads. They succeeded, just barely, and the guns resumed firing. Around 2 a.m. reinforcements from the 164th Infantry finally reached the line, adding depth behind Puller's Marines, but the Japanese continued attacking in waves. Smaller, desperate waves now, less coordinated, more erratic, but still deadly. Around 3 a.m., Basilone's guns ran out of water. The water jackets had boiled dry, and without cooling the barrels would warp and fail. In an act both absurd and heroic, Basilone and his crews urinated into the water jackets, filling them enough to keep the guns functional for another hour of relentless firing. By 4 a.m., the Japanese attacks lost cohesion. Their officers were dead. Their units scattered. The jungle fell silent except for occasional moans and the buzz of insects beginning their morning chorus. At dawn, the scale of the carnage became visible. Hundreds of Japanese bodies lay in front of Basilone sector, later counted at nearly 1,000, with several hundred more between the wire and the tree line. Of the 16 men in Basilone's 2 machine gun sections, only 3, including Basilone himself, were left standing uninjured. The Japanese tried again on October 25, but by then reinforcements had strengthened the line, and Puller's battalion repelled every attack. Hyakutake finally called off the offensive, the once elite Sendai division reduced to a shattered remnant, its survivors staggering into the jungle and dying from starvation, wounds, and disease. The failure at Henderson Field permanently shifted the Guadalcanal campaign in favor of the Americans. What the Japanese High Command discovered that night, and what they had never imagined possible, was that the Marines on Guadalcanal did not break. They fought with equal determination, greater firepower, and a refusal to yield that shocked Japanese doctrine built on Bushido ideals. Basilone received the Medal of Honor, becoming the first enlisted Marine of World War II to receive it, and he insisted that most of the medal belonged to the men who died on Guadalcanal. Sent home for war bond tours, he begged repeatedly to return to combat. Eventually, he was allowed to join the 5th Marine Division for the assault on Iwo Jima, where he landed with the first wave on February 19, 1945. Under blistering enemy fire, he destroyed a Japanese blockhouse single-handedly by climbing onto its top and dropping grenades and demolition charges into its gun ports, then guided a trapped tank out of a minefield under intense fire, minutes before he was killed by a mortar blast. He was 28. Posthumously awarded the Navy Cross, he became the only enlisted Marine in World War II to receive both the Medal of Honor and the Navy Cross. His widow, Lena, never remarried, wore her wedding ring until her death in 1999, and attended memorial events in his honor for the rest of her life. Basilone's legend continued to grow, taught to every Marine recruit, depicted in the HBO series The Pacific, and honored through parades, statues, naval ships, and military tradition. His story, and the story of the night he held off an entire Japanese regiment with dwindling ammunition, sick and exhausted Marines, and sheer refusal to let the enemy through, stands as one of the most extraordinary examples of courage, endurance, and battlefield brilliance in United States Marine Corps history. It was a night when fewer than 24 Marines held a line against thousands, when discipline defeated desperation, when firepower defeated spirit, when a young machine gun section leader from New Jersey changed the course of the Pacific War not through orders or strategy or grand movements of armies, but through grit, determination, and an unwavering commitment to the men beside him, proving that sometimes history turns not on vast fleets or national strategies, but on the actions of a single Marine standing his ground in the darkest hours of the night, keeping Henderson Field, and the U.S. lifeline to Australia, firmly in American hands, ensuring that Guadalcanal would mark the beginning of Japan's long retreat and the rise of American momentum in the Pacific, a legacy carried forward by every Marine who remembers those who fought on the ridge that night and kept their promise. Marines do not retreat. Marines hold.